The USA Patriot Act was passed through Congress in 2001 with goals of increasing the surveillance of the American people. This presentation will assess if the Patriot Act correctly balances American freedoms with American securities. The two primary ways the government was able to implement and maintain the Patriot Act are through careful political strategies and technological advancements. Many of the policies that were created in the Patriot Act are based off of the 1978 Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. FISA dictates and uses procedures for physical and electronic surveillance and has been amended repeatedly since the Patriot Act was passed. Before the Patriot Act was put into law, the United States was already on the lookout for terrorist attacks. The FBI in Phoenix, Arizona, sent a memo to the White House urging them to watch out for terrorists linked to Al-Qaeda in U.S. flight schools looking for jobs flying U.S. planes. On August 6, 2001, the presidential daily brief of the morning was given to President Bush. It was titled, "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the U.S., and specifically said that a group of suspected terrorists connected to Al-Qaeda were in the U.S. applying for pilot jobs. At 9:03 a.m., September 11, 2001, when the second plane crashed into the South Tower, the American people became afraid of what could happen next. The event was quickly identified as a terrorist attack, and Al-Qaeda was soon identified as the perpetrators of what was the largest and most deadly attack on American soil ever. Between the two planes that crashed into the World Trade Center, the plane that flew into the Pentagon, and the fourth plane that crash-landed in a field in Pennsylvania, a total of 2,996 people were killed that day. This was by far the largest act of terror ever committed inside the U.S., but it was not the first. Just earlier that year, envelopes containing anthrax spores were mailed to several politicians. And in 1993, a car bomb ripped through the parking garage of the Trade Center North Tower. The bomb was designed to take out support beams and tip the North Tower into the South Tower. All of these attacks together sparked questions if more could be done to prevent terrorist attacks, and after 9/11, everybody was afraid of what could happen next. For politicians and government organizations who wanted more surveillance, 9/11 presented an opportunity. Just 6 weeks later, President George Bush signed the USA Patriot Act. The Patriot Act is not specifically designed to be patriotic, though. The USA Patriot Act is an acronym, short for United and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. In fact, in the years after the Act was passed, it has become more and more evident to the American people that the Patriot Act sacrifices lots of constitutional rights and has faced increasing opposition. Politicians in Congress and those who supported the Patriot Act would call critics of it unpatriotic. This contributed to an image that people who were against the new surveillance programs were anti-American, and people who hated America were all terrorists. The Patriot Act was designed specifically to combat terrorism by lowering several legal barricades that had previously restricted the government from quickly catching terrorists or finding activities that were related to terrorists. It mostly achieves this by intercepting communications and speeding up the warrant system. In President Bush's post-9/11 State of the Union address, he asks why terrorists hate America. He responds to his own question. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote. Fear of further terrorism may be what caused the Patriot Act to be passed so quickly. On October 23, 2001, just 6 weeks after the September 11th attacks, the Patriot Act was introduced to the House. The next day, on October 24th, the Act passed the House, 357 to 66. On October 25th, it passed the Senate, 98-1. On October 26th, President Bush signed it into law, 4 days after members of Congress saw it for the first time. It is worth mentioning the Patriot Act is 347 pages long and was supposedly written within 6 weeks and read and passed by the House in less than a day. The Act was one of the two most important measures that went through Congress in reaction to terrorism, along with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. The acronym for the Patriot Act is appropriately named, in that the Act strives to give the government new tools to intercept and obstruct terrorism. The one overall goal of the Patriot Act was to give federal officers greater authority to track and intercept communications, both for foreign intelligence gathering and law enforcement purposes. It created new crimes, new penalties, and new procedures, which are all more efficient, all for the use of domestic and international terrorists. It also attempts to close our borders to foreign terrorists and to detain and remove those within our borders. The third major section of the Patriot Act gave money to the Secretary of the Treasury in order to fight corruption in U.S. financial institutions for foreign money laundering purposes. Since its creation, the Patriot Act has received lots of criticisms regarding its constitutionality and the haste with which it was passed. Some of the new laws and penalties created had the effect of voiding several steps in the normal detention and prosecution processes. The way that the Patriot Act is written permits the government to investigate and then detain non-citizens. One such example of this is the infamous prison camp in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Prisoners at Guantanamo under the Patriot Act are not entitled to a speedy and public trial. This, and several other constitutional rights, are not applicable at Guantanamo. The prison was created because the prisoners didn't qualify for habeas corpus rights at the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base because it is not an official U.S. territory. Initially, the Bush administration didn't even require for the prison to follow the human rights standards laid out by the Geneva Conventions. The Patriot Act made it legal for the government to imprison these primarily Middle Eastern men in Guantanamo Bay without ever being convicted of a crime and without a specific time length of their detention. In 2004, the New York Times published a leaked memo that exposed a Red Cross examination of the prison that had accused the U.S. military of using various forms of torture and blatantly called the facility an intentional system of cruel, unusual, and degrading treatment and a form of torture. While the Obama administration has promised to shut down the prison multiple times, they have been doing this since 2009, and the prison remains open. The prison often resurfaces in the news when inmates participate in hunger strikes. It can be easily argued that the United States has had completely sufficient means to combat terrorism before the Patriot Act was passed, and that the Patriot Act is a ploy to increase an Orwellian surveillance state. Politicians in Congress and George Bush were able to use the stateless entity of terror to declare war between freedom and fear. Supposedly, the Patriot Act suppresses fear and promotes freedom. In order to truly understand the extent of the powers of the Patriot Act, the technology of the surveillance must be investigated. The depth of surveillance was exposed by Edward Snowden in 2013, who worked for the National Security Agency. The NSA, which was created in 1952, has had a goal of globally collecting and analyzing data for counterintelligence and foreign intelligence purposes. The NSA was granted more extensive surveillance powers underneath the Patriot Act. The NSA is full of highly confidential programs and information due to its nature as a secret intelligence gathering organization. The Patriot Act also promoted the use of roving wiretaps in order to continue surveillance on a person who is trying to evade a wiretap. Roving wiretaps gave the government the power to collect phone calls from specific people, regardless of what physical phone the call was being made from. Before this, judges had to approve each individual phone for wiretapping. While they were first approved in 1988 by the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, the Patriot Act widely expanded the usage of roving wiretaps. The NSA was a matter of political controversy before, but in 2013, Edward Snowden leaked thousands of documents to news networks that exposed the true extent of surveillance. One of the most shocking surveillance things that was leaked by Snowden was the existence of an NSA program codenamed PRISM. PRISM has been searching through almost all international internet traffic and telephone conversations since 2007. This global surveillance outraged many countries around the world and sparked issues of trust. PRISM demanded that internet and telecommunications corporations, such as Google or Verizon, turn over all data that contain any code word or theme that a judge had previously approved. A project run by PRISM called Stormbrew bypasses this step by pulling data directly out of fiber optic wires. Warrantlessly, Stormbrew searches through the world's communication data in search of possible crimes in order to prevent them from happening in the first place, a process called predictive policing. The NSA has created or maintained security holes in almost all software and encryptions, which lets the NSA, and potentially any other party, take any information they want out of all internet communications. The Patriot Act has transformed America into a country that would rather keep a close eye on American people than maintain our constitutional rights and liberty. The Bush administration said that it promoted freedoms for Americans, but it can be argued that different parts of the Patriot Act can void freedom of association, freedom of information, freedom of speech, freedom of unreasonable searches, the right to a speedy and public trial, the right to legal representation, and the right to liberty. With the passage of the Patriot Act, this country no longer correctly balances American freedom and American security.